Hello, everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit Projections online at projectionsinc.com. I'm Beth Pilgreen, and I'll be your host for today's episode of Project HR. Just when you'd sorted out millennials in the workplace, along comes Generation Z. Consensus places Gen Z's population at about 90 million, which means that this generation is more populous than the millennials, 25% larger than the baby boomers, and 35% bigger than Generation X. We're looking at a major generational influx of Gen Z workers, and it's happening as we speak. As soon as 2025, it's predicted that Gen Z will make up 27% of the workforce, which means that if you haven't gotten up to speed on who this generation is and what motivates them in the workplace, it's time to catch up. And there's no one better qualified to help you do just that than today's guest. Joining us on the program is Christine Selph. Christine is the Global Eminence and Engagement Leader at Deloitte, and she's also served as the Development Leader for the Deloitte Global Millennial and Gen Z Survey. For the last decade, this survey has been taking the pulse on the attitudes of millennials and Gen Z, as well as the events and trends affecting them. So Christine, happy 10th anniversary to the survey, and welcome to Project HR. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this discussion. So let's talk about this survey. What inspired this decade of research?
So, we started this survey 10 years ago because our clients were coming to us asking for advice around this new generation that was coming up in the workforce. They had different needs and wants, and they were a lot more vocal than previous generations had. Our clients wanted to better understand their values and what was driving them, and also, of course, how to attract and retain them. And in addition to our clients, there was also a large and growing millennial population within the Deloitte workforce as well, with similar aspirations, wants, and needs. So we decided to launch this global survey to really understand and explore this generation's attitudes about life, about work, and also the world around them.
So interesting. I love that people were so perplexed that you guys had to dive into this survey for 10 years.
That's right.
So when did you start including Gen Z in the survey?
So we started surveying Gen Z in 2018. The
Okay.
oldest Gen Zs were 23 years old at the time, and they were just beginning to enter the workforce. So while millennials, make up the majority of the global workforce today, it's Gen Zs who are going to be filling those internships and the entry
Right.
level roles for years to come. With the oldest members of Gen Z now entering the workforce, it's really essential for companies to understand how their youngest employees will operate in the workforce and how they may differ from their millennial counterparts.
So why do you think it's so important for these companies to understand the generational shifts in their workforce?
So, understanding generational shifts is a critical way for organizations to understand how their workforce values, views, priorities, and preferences are changing over time. You
Mhm.
simply cannot create a positive workforce culture or attract and retain top talent, for that matter, without understanding the people in your workforce. And by understanding each generation, this is going to lead to changes in the workplace that will actually benefit all generations. So, for example, as a result of being very vocal about their needs at work and their expectations of business, millennials have actually driven a lot of the positive changes that we've seen in the workplace over the years. They were the first generation to demand more flexibility in terms of where and when they work. They have consistently called for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion among their peers and also their leadership. And we know that they are deeply concerned about the state of the world. from climate change to wealth inequality. And they also want business and their organizations to play a bigger role in addressing these issues. And so as a result, we are seeing the rise of stakeholder capitalism. And if you're not familiar with that term, that's when companies seek long term value creation, taking into account the needs of all their stakeholders and society at large, not just profits. So we're seeing a rise in stakeholder capitalism. We're also, of course, seeing a move towards hybrid working environments, which
Hmm.
was a shift that's been greatly accelerated by the pandemic. And we're also seeing a greater focus in creating more diverse and inclusive work environments.
Okay, Christine, you should know that one of the earliest episodes of this podcast focused on better understanding the millennials. And as we've been talking about, here comes Gen Z. What makes Gen Z different from the millennials?
As you can imagine, these two generations do share similar priorities. However, Gen Zs seem to be even more adamant on some of these topics than millennials. So, for example, over the past few years, climate change has been at the top of the concern list for millennials and also for Gen Zs. But this year, climate change slipped to number three for millennials behind unemployment and healthcare concerns. But for Gen Zs, it stayed their number one concern, even during a health pandemic. Sustainability actually drives a lot of Gen Z's consumer decisions. For example, they're less inclined than even millennials to shop with companies who harm the environment, for example. And a company's climate stance can even influence whether Gen Zs will work for them or not. And secondly, as a generation that grew up with the always on environment that technology and social media enables, Gen Zs also struggle with high stress levels. But to that end, they are also more open to conversations about mental health in the workplace than
Hmm.
millennials are. And they're looking to destigmatize that topic at work.
I wonder what makes them more comfortable to talk about mental health than millennials. Have you found anything with that?
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to Gen Zs not being afraid to question authority or
Hmm.
how it's always been. And I think that because mental health has always been one of those topics that was reserved for out of work,
Right.
millennials, kind of continued that trend. But Gen Zs have come along and said, this is part of who I am.
Hmm.
And if my company is really going to understand that and they want me to be my authentic self, then I have to bring up some of my mental health issues or concerns in order to be able to come to work as myself every day.
I really appreciate that. What do you think is contributing to the high stress factors? I can relate to that, but I am millennial, 2 weeks of being a millennial. So, what do you think with Gen Z that makes them so high stress?
So I think with Gen Z, I mean, certainly the past year perhaps has been a bit of an anomaly, and
Hmm.
things such as families' health and welfare definitely topped the list as the highest concern and contributing to the highest stress levels for Gen Zs.
Right.
But other things like unemployment and also financial concerns also
Hmm.
contributes to their stress. And I think that as Gen Zs, again, have been kind of moving away from being at university, perhaps living with their parents, and now have had to take on, monetary concerns of their own, I
Hmm.
absolutely think that that has contributed to their stress levels, particularly having to do so during a global pandemic when their work situation and employment has at times been questionable.
I can see too, with them being in the social media age, the comparison factor has got to play a role in this stress too. Because during the pandemic or even before the pandemic, with when it comes to finances, they can be struggling themselves, but then they look at their neighbor who is only posting great things about their lives and assuming, oh man, he or she's really doing awesome right now. And then, they compare and put it back on themselves, which I would assume would create more stress.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We actually asked about social media two surveys ago. And what we found is that Gen Zs really have a love hate relationship with social media.
Really?
They kind of love it and they need it because it's how they communicate and stay in
Yeah.
touch with families and friends. But on the other hand, um, it absolutely contributes to their feelings of inadequacy
Mhm.
and also that feeling that they always have to be checking it and fear of missing out.
Mhm.
I think it's a really tough, it's a tough platform for them to love and hate.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate too. I guess it goes into many generations, but all right, Christine, we are now going to take a sponsorship break, but when we return, we'll dig into the findings of the 2021 Deloitte survey and talk about how we can best prepare ourselves and our workplaces for this new generation. So stay with us.
Well, hold on, this isn't quite a sponsorship break. I've actually got a really exciting announcement instead. To celebrate the end of our second year of weekly Project HR episodes, we are doing another big book giveaway. If you remember, last year we gave away a book from every author who appeared on Project HR in 2020. Now we're doing the same for 2021. Just by helping us spread the word about Project HR and all the great things we talk about over here, you could win a copy of every book featured on the podcast this year. That's well over a dozen titles from the best of HR, including Jennifer Moss's Burnout Epidemic, Perry Tim's second edition of Transformational HR, Dr. Scott Beeson's Whole Person Workplace, and so many more. To get all the details, head over to projectionsinc.com/podcast.
We're back with Christine Selph, Global Eminence and Engagement Leader at Deloitte and Development Leader for the Deloitte Global Millennial and Gen Z Survey. Now, before the break, we talked about Gen Z in comparison to millennials, but let's take them out of that millennial shadow and talk about what's made them the people they are today. What realities or events formed this generation?
So both generations were shaped by the rise of digital platforms and social media. But Gen Zs are the true digital natives who don't remember a world without smartphones or social media. And there are likely many implications of growing up in this environment that we don't fully understand yet. But I
Mhm.
think a positive result is that it has made Gen Zs more likely to speak up, to question authority, and to also seek to drive change on the issues that matter most to them. Gen Zs are also entering a workforce profoundly disrupted by the pandemic. And keep
Mhm.
in mind that while many millennials and other generations are working remotely now, most at some point in their careers have spent time in person in an office. But Gen Zs, many of them are starting their careers remotely. It remains to be seen how that will impact their workplace priorities and preferences and also their career trajectories. But it's absolutely the case that because they haven't met a lot of their coworkers and team leaders yet, that they have started their jobs in a very different place than previous generations. So, another area that we're actually going to be exploring in next year's survey is the rise of the side gig. And as they enter the workforce, many Gen Zs also seem to be pursuing side jobs, whether it's dog walking, making things to sell through Etsy, being influencers, or even hosting podcasts. Coming of age during a difficult job market and also because of the technology and social media at their fingertips, Gen Zs have new opportunities that actually make them particularly entrepreneurial. And it will be interesting to see how organizations and managers navigate this with their Gen Z employees.
I think this part is so interesting. Now, because I know so many people, I will say Gen Z and millennial, who have a side gig. And I'm wondering in your research, or maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but is there any way that you could tell me, like, what do you think is contributing towards this generation having multiple jobs and being so entrepreneurial?
Yeah, I think when we first started hearing about the gig economy, I think it actually really stemmed from this desire, especially for of millennials, to want to control their working hours. And the careers that they were finding straight out of university, college, in a lot of cases still had that 9 to 5 in an office environment. And I think a lot of millennials at the time said, this is not for me, and I'm going to go and work for myself and set my own hours, etc. Um, and I think that that's morphed. I mean, certainly more organizations are now offering flexibility, particularly in the face of the pandemic. But I think what Gen Z is finding attractive about these side gigs, it's really about being able to pursue their passions and things and causes that they really believe in. That dog walker that I mentioned, yeah, of course, it's nice to have extra money in your pocket, but also people want to spend time doing things that they love. So whether they love hanging out with dogs or they love crocheting knits to sell on Etsy, I think another byproduct of the pandemic was realizing, we spend so much of our time at our jobs, and they want to be make sure that they're being personally fulfilled, and why not make a little bit of money doing it?
I love that. Christine, what does Gen Z value in general and in the workplace?
So, we've already discussed how climate change consistently sits at the top of Gen Z's list of concerns.
Hmm.
Further, as consumers, they often put their wallets where their values are, stopping or initiating relationships based on how companies treat the environment, protect personal data, and position themselves on social and political issue. So, for example, this past year, almost a third of Gen Zs started or deepened consumer relationships with companies based on their response to the COVID-19 crisis, while around a quarter stopped or lessened relationships for the same reason.
Wow.
And their values in the workplace very much align with their values in the world more broadly. And they also guide their career decisions. Gen Zs are even more likely than millennials to make decisions about the organizations they'll work for and the type of work they'll do based on their values.
Hmm.
They want to work for organizations who have a purpose beyond profit. They also want to work for organizations that offer them learning and development opportunities and enable that work life balance. These are key aspects that attract Gen Zs to an organization and also what makes them stay. And then finally, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gen Zs are the most diverse generation to date, and they have deep concerns about the inequality and racism in our society and also in the workplace. And they are pushing for change.
I love that that's such a value for them in the workplace, and also that they are so passionate about choosing a place to work that does align with their values. So let's talk about the unprecedented diversity of Gen Z and what that means for business.
So, in last year's survey, 1 in 5 Gen Z said that they feel personally discriminated against all or most of the time because of an aspect of their backgrounds. And 2/3 of those surveyed this year said that their organization performs well in creating diverse and inclusive work environments. But that still leaves 38% of Gen Zs who believe systematic racism is widespread in their workplaces.
Hmm.
Businesses need to prioritize diversity and inclusion in order to attract and retain the best talent. Over the years, our survey has consistently shown that those respondents who feel their organization does a good job creating a diverse and inclusive working environment are more likely to want to stay with their employers. And it's not just about making diverse hiring decisions, it's about creating cultures where people feel valued and included. And that means changing a lot of traditional ways of doing things. It could mean, for example, doing away with unpaid internships because they naturally give an advantage to people who can afford to work without pay. It also means weeding out conscious and unconscious bias in the hiring process and also in everyday behaviors. So, for example, making sure that everyone in your workforce is educated about microaggressions so that they can identify and correct those behaviors is also critical.
Okay, let's talk about the pandemic now and its impact on the workforce. The pandemic hit even the older Gen Zs early in their careers, and for the rest, it's definitely disrupted their education. Do you think the pandemic will leave a lasting impact on this generation? And if so, how?
I think the pandemic is absolutely going to leave a lasting impact on Gen Zs and on businesses in general. So, two trends that have already emerged. The first is obviously remote and flexible work. There is no question that the pandemic has sped up a transition towards more remote work. Many industries that previously didn't think remote work was even a possibility now see that their workforces can, in fact, do their jobs remotely. And for many Gen Zs, as we mentioned before, they're actually starting their careers in this virtual environment. So it's going to be very interesting to see the impact that this has, whether they wish they could have more time in person, whether it impacts their career progression as a result of having less time, face time with their leaders. But ultimately, what our study has shown us is that Gen Zs really value flexibility in the
Hmm.
workplace. So it's very unlikely that they're going to accept going back to a world where they're required to go into an office full time if it's not necessary.
I can absolutely see that.
I think the other trend that's already emerged is around purpose. And as we've touched upon, the pandemic has really made a lot of people reevaluate what's important in their lives. And this has likely contributed to the great resignation that we're seeing as many people switch to new jobs. Some people are leaving to go to jobs that offer more flexibility so that they can spend more time doing the things that they love rather than making long commutes. And others are leaving to find jobs that more closely align to their values. In fact, our survey this year found that about 15% of respondents said that after reflecting on the pandemic and their values and aspirations, that they either left their jobs or they started new careers.
Hmm. I actually know a number of people who are in that same boat too. So, I mean, the pandemic has changed a lot of mindsets out there. Well, Christine, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and our guest today is Christine Selph, Global Eminence and Engagement Leader at Deloitte and Development Leader for the Deloitte Global Millennial and Gen Z Survey. We are back. Christine, in your opinion, what are the key takeaways for business leaders from the 2021 survey?
There are a few key business takeaways that we discuss in our report. So, the first is to reevaluate the ways that organizations look at hiring and retention in order to promote that diversity and inclusion that we discussed earlier. Also, examining the role that business can play in supporting employees that are struggling with economic uncertainty and financial stress. Ensure that their organization is working towards environmental goals. Prioritize mental health support and resources and create cultures where it's okay to acknowledge stress and ask for a break.
Mm-hmm.
Another takeaway for leaders, which touches on an issue we didn't get into as much here, is to acknowledge the impact that the pandemic has had on working women. The pandemic has disproportionately affected women. They are more stressed than men, they're shouldering more of the burden at home, more worried about finances, and more concerned about equity and discrimination. So,
Hmm.
employers can support women during this time by offering the flexibility and resources that they need, and more long term, working to pursue initiatives that alleviate challenges and biases that are unique to women in the workplace.
I appreciate that information. I didn't realize that it had impacted women to that degree. I want to bring our discussion back to the survey's 10-year anniversary. What an amazing landmark. As we look back, what have been the biggest trends on this decade of research on our youngest generation?
Throughout the years, our survey has identified several key themes. So, the first is the importance of workplace culture. While pay and benefits might be top of mind when weighing a new job, a positive workplace culture comes in a close second. And our survey has consistently found over the years that those who feel that their employer is doing a good job on areas that contribute to workplace culture, so like creating a diverse and inclusive working environment, having a positive impact on local communities, and providing a motivating and stimulating working environment, are more likely to want to stay with their employers versus moving on to a new job. So, another trend is that all along, millennials and Gen Zs have had an eye towards the future. So, in addition to influencing businesses to act on issues such as flexible work and mental health, and also promoting the ideals of stakeholder capitalism long before it was popular, they prioritized certain societal threats early on. In our first three surveys, resource scarcity ranked as the top or second most imposing societal challenge, and climate change was close behind that, as was income inequality. By 2018, climate change had swooped to their primary concern, and it stayed at or near the top since then, despite pressing challenges around healthcare and employment. They are hopeful that the post pandemic world will build on lessons learned during the past year. More than a third in our most recent survey said that they believe the COVID-19 experience will boost businesses' sense of responsibility, improve cooperation between countries, and cause more people to take personal action in the fight against climate change. Another trend we've seen over the years is that millennials and Gen Zs want more from business. Perhaps the most consistent finding throughout the past decade is the belief that business has both a responsibility to improve society and the greatest potential to drive change. However, millennials and Gen Zs don't think that it's living up to that potential or their expectations.
It sounds like they're very vocal, but that can be a positive thing for the workplace, right? And for their own careers.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. Another big trend that we've seen over the past decade is that they really are agents of change. They want to be forces for good, and they're looking to their employers to help them achieve that. So they want to work for organizations that empower them and enable them to play active roles in society. We continue to see millennials and Gen Zs channeling their energies towards meaningful action on issues that really matter most to them, from increasing political involvement to aligning their spending and career choices with their values.
Christine, what does the future hold for the survey?
So, planning for our 2022 survey is already underway. And one big change that we're going to be doing this year is shifting the balance of power in terms of surveying more Gen Zs this year than millennials, as Gen Z starts to become that youngest generation in the workforce. However, we'll still also continue to survey millennials and compare the two generations. This next year, we're also going to be taking a closer look at the lasting impact of the pandemic on the future of work. And we're going to be digging deeper into climate change and the types of decisions that millennials and Gen Zs are making to try and address it. So look out for our 2022 survey in May of next year.
Christine, I am so eager to hear your findings. I'm serious. And of course, the company behind all of this valuable research I wanted to reiterate is Deloitte. And I must say, this generational drive to improve the world really tracks with Deloitte's goals as well. Can you explain that to our audience?
Yes, it really does align with Deloitte's purpose, which is to make an impact that matters for our clients, our people, and the communities in which we live and work. At Deloitte, we believe we have a responsibility to be a force for good and to lead the way on the increasingly complex challenges that society faces. So, we have a program called World Impact, which is our portfolio of initiatives focused on making a tangible impact on society's biggest challenges and creating a more sustainable and equitable world.
Well, where can our listeners go to learn more about you, the survey, or Deloitte?
Sure. Just go to www.deloitte.com/millennial survey to see this year's survey as well as past surveys.
And links to the 2021 Deloitte Global Millennial and Gen Z survey, as well as to Deloitte's website, will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to unlock it today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Christine, it's time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about the rise of Generation Z. Which of these songs, popular with older generations, is more iconic of its time? The B-52's Song for a Future Generation or The Who's My Generation?
Well, I'm old school, so I would say My Generation by The Who.
Okay. What's the best movie you've seen recently?
So I watched 12 Angry Men for the first time last week. This was thanks to a leadership course I took, and we used the movie as a case study.
Oh, I haven't seen that. What's your favorite thing about the work you do?
So I love seeing how our insights really help companies and leaders make important decisions that have huge impacts, not only on business, but on the world in general.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Don't change to please other people.
Oh, I love that, and I'm writing it down. Who or what inspires you?
So my kids inspire me. They haven't yet been told by society that they can't do something or they aren't good enough. So they don't limit themselves before they even try. And that is very inspiring to me.
That's inspiring to me too. They're so fearless. Well, Christine, thanks for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR. Thanks to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. To make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, we hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. Finally, don't forget that Project HR's Big Book Giveaway begins next week. So go to www.projectionsinc.com to get all the details. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.